Hawaii, then Utah, then back to California. Hi, everyone. I'm Timi Leslie. I'm with BluePath Health, and we've been working with many of you for several years. And on the regulatory and legal side, I think we hit our heads against the wall so many times of working with our regulators and having them be partners with us as we launch these new ways of doing business. Our work up in Sacramento, I just want to highlight, is around e-consult, if any of you are doing provider-to-provider work. We just released the new code for Medi-Cal that'll pay for e-consult, so that's over 5 years worth of work. In addition, the new provider manual for Medi-Cal includes at-home visits or virtual visits, so we can all applaud there. I am going to introduce, Alexis, do you want to go first? Alexis Gilroy, who is with Jones Day. I'm so sorry, I need my glasses on. And you grew up in North Carolina, in the mountains, up there in the Smoky Mountains, so we're coast to coast. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much, Timi. Yeah. I like conquering big challenges, tall challenges, so yeah. And I think I need the clicker from you. Yep, sorry about that. Great, and today we're gonna talk a little bit about international. Here we go, perfect. So I'm going to start with, and it was great, it was good to follow on the Latin American experience because I'm going to look at it a bit more cross-border. So where, I think some of the questions were going, and mostly I'm going to look at, exporting U.S., right? So going from the U.S. Cross-border and look at, from our experience, I'm a healthcare attorney, so see a lot of different things that are happening, and I'm going to try to share a little bit about what we're seeing, what the challenges we're trying to help folks, clients solve from the legal regulatory front. So a few, overview, you can't understand what is possible moving forward, and there's a lot of work that needs to be done here. I'll give you some thoughts on that, but we have to at least first identify what are the issues that we need to comfort. And then a few reminders. There's a few nitty-gritty here that I think people tend to not understand, and they're actually really important, so I want to throw out a few of those reminders. So to start with, and this actually, specialty telemedicine consults have been going on for a really long time, right? If you think about it, this was sort of what academic medical centers were doing even 20 years ago, early satellite, feeds hitting out for really more developing countries, really trying to do charity work in some very unique ways, and a lot of little pockets of this were happening. Today, this is a really interesting, evolving topic. You still have some very interesting charity programs in developing countries, cross-border, usually free services, things like that. But increasingly, there are some collaboration opportunities. It might be that you have someone from the Middle East or Asia that has come to the U.S. for a residency program, et cetera, and now they're going home. They've developed wonderful relationships. They want to stay in touch with their colleagues, et cetera, and so they're continuing those relationships. We'll talk in a minute about some of the legal issues involved, but these are provider-to-provider specialty consults, right? Sometimes educational, sometimes a little more than that, but we're starting to see increasing a lot of interest in this really across the board, not just developing countries, but Europe, Asia, Middle East in particular, a little bit in Latin America, but not quite as much there yet. And then, this has also been something for a long time in telehealth. Actually, some of my early telehealth experience was with teleradiology companies. And, teleradiology companies were very smart. They knew how to advance efficiencies using offshore support. Sometimes that was offshore healthcare providers who were looking at the scans, et cetera, first, advancing what the U.S. providers could do as well. Sometimes it was just support in the form of technology support, answering support, the classic sort of things. I'll mention a few things in a minute legally that it's very important to remember in this category, but this is something with remote patient monitoring programs in particular. We're seeing a lot of interest in this. There's a lot of opportunity to advance your telemedicine offering with not only US-based providers, but providers outside the US working in collaboration with each other. The second opinion, right? And I actually think this is different from specialty, note I put this in a different category than specialty consultation, right? And that's very intentional from a legal perspective. Second opinion programs sometimes can be educational programs, sometimes are more diagnostically oriented. There's some distinctions there that are very important and can be very important outside the US from a regulatory perspective. But this is a huge growing area, both with providers in other countries who are looking for very particular US-based expert opinions, and there's companies in the US now that have really commoditized these types of arrangements. And then there's also high net worth individuals outside the US. I sort of think of these things as mostly marketing types of programs for academic medical centers, healthcare systems in the US, to enable patients to sort of try them out, right? You know, are we the right fit for you? Do we have the ability to meet your particular very unique need? Once we cross that threshold, then you might come to the US for services, sort of reverse medical tourism. And then this is the area, you can call this lots of different things. I put digitizing pharma, but I think the biggest interesting increase we've seen over the last year or two is really this merger, collision, if you will, between healthcare, digital health, and life science. Don't have a deep life science background by training, but I've really had to catch up significantly. There's two pieces of this. One is the life science companies that are using digital capabilities to advance how they perform trials, right? Everything from e-consenting to, using support providers, nurses, et cetera, who engage with the PI or the sub-I in a digital manner. But interestingly, there's also some ways, this is where the telehealth piece, where they've said, gosh, you're doing some amazing things via telemedicine. Could we apply those workflows in the clinical trial process? So some people are calling it decentralized clinical trials, virtual trials. It's really interesting. We've been actually looking at it from a legal perspective really, really hard. I think clinicians and the life science community has been looking at this space really, really hard. There's a lot of interest and excitement because you have the opportunity for a hugely expanded gene pool, right, of potential participants for trials, especially for orphan drugs and things like that, that can be really transformational, but it's very difficult. There's some great white papers, if you will, that the FDA is starting to put out on this and really look deeply at this area. So stay tuned, but I think it's definitely here to stay. And we can actually teach them, I think, how to do decentralized clinical trials, right? We know a little bit about telemedicine. We're a little ahead of them, and we can be a big player and partner in that area. Last is direct-to-consumer. Again, different category than the second opinion. This one's really hard cross-border, not surprisingly, and I think you mentioned this a little bit in Latin America earlier. Here, I think, there's everything from educational content, WebMD, HealthTap, those types of companies, to folks that really are trying to do actual medicine. The prescribing piece alone is very difficult cross-border, but perhaps there's an educational component. And again, I'm speaking just cross-border. There is a huge amount of advancement within countries outside the US for digital direct-to-consumer telehealth. We are seeing that in Europe in particular, and in Asia and the Middle East, in addition to Latin America, which you heard about earlier. So just a quick laundry list of some of the legal considerations at play: health regulatory, no surprise there. Where are you practicing medicine? But importantly, are you practicing medicine in that jurisdiction? It's very interesting. We've looked at, probably in various projects, close to 40 countries now. And this varies, just as much as it does in the US among our states. But it's really important to understand that piece, because that might help you understand, is this an educational service? Can we craft it in such a way so we're not practicing medicine? Important first question. But if you are, there generally is a licensure requirement similar to what we deal with here. And again, you might have to take a test. Your medical school may not apply in another country. All these other little considerations are at play. There's a few countries, Honduras and Saipan, not really, that we have found that actually have exceptions for a specialty provider licensed in another country, meaning the US. They can actually consult without being licensed in that jurisdiction. So that's great. That's actually my little play from a policy standpoint that we really need to advance more broadly than those two countries, but it's a start. The other things that are really important to remember are the data privacy piece, the device registration, and IP considerations. You know, you want to protect especially your device capabilities abroad, and then business licenses and taxes. And lastly, because you may not have heard about this before, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and this is something the US government takes very, very seriously. Essentially, the way people do business outside the US may not quite be the way we do business here, right? There may be a lot more expectation for gifts and other types of things. You really need to work with somebody to understand what that means, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, how that could apply as you get into negotiating relationships outside the US. So just, you know, we won't have time to go through these, but, you know, I think the big one here is historically there was sort of this, well, there's not, I mean, what can they do to me, right? And we're just gonna fly under the radar, right? There's an extreme increasing risk for taking that approach. I mean, I would tell you it's always probably not the best approach to take, but think about whether there's a way to consider your program as an educational-only program, if there's a way to work with an in-country provider and establish a contractual relationship where they help you go through the in-country requirements that are necessary. And there's ways that we can really streamline and figure out the best way to navigate those other country requirements. The one last piece I just want to put on a plug to remember is that Medicare, Medicare Advantage, Medicaid, et cetera, do have specific limitations on using a healthcare provider when they are not on US soil. So you can't actually submit a claim for Medicare for a healthcare provider that's not in the US when they're performing the service. It's a little nuanced thing. Medicare Advantage and Medicaid often will also have reporting requirements around that. So just keep that in mind as you look at different arrangements and understand what your requirements are, because that actually can get into some fraud issues that you want to stay away from. All right, that's it.
So I'm going to get this right. With Ian Pearson, also with Jones Day. I worked with James Day. And Ian worked at the FDA and is now practicing around devices and the FDA. All right, come on up. He's getting married soon.
Hello, everyone. As mentioned, my name's Ian Pearson. I'm an attorney with Jones Day. I'm based out of the San Francisco office, so I am a local. Before that, I did work for FDA for a number of years, for about 7.5, 8 years, and was really a part of their digital health initiatives as they were starting to get it off the ground. And so that's the perspective that I'm coming at this talk today for. And I know it's kind of an ancillary topic to a lot of traditional telehealth organizations, but as mentioned from previous speakers, what we're starting to see and what I'm certainly starting to observe in my own practice is that there's this convergence of practice of medicine and technology that's coming together. That, you know, where we're starting with telemedicine with just video communication, you know, phone communication. There's all these new technologies that are starting to be incorporated into that process that may be regulated by FDA. And with my own clients, what I've seen is, you know, some have been ready for it and some haven't. And the worst thing that can happen is you start to incorporate all this really cool, all this really new tech. You know, things are going great, and then you get a letter from FDA that says, hey, it's come to our attention that you have a product that does X, Y, or Z. We think this is a medical device, and now you have 15 days to respond to us to tell us why you're on the market legally. So with that as the backdrop, that super inspiring backdrop, let's talk about some FDA basics. And I know that people have different levels of experience with this topic here in the room. So I find it's usually good to start right from the beginning because there isn't a distinction between a software-based product and sort of traditional hardware-based medical devices as you think about them. The definition of a medical device is really kind of long-winded. You can find it in Section 201H of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. I'm not going to rehash the entire thing to you right now, but you can generally think of a medical device as a medical product that doesn't work through chemical action or by being metabolized. To break that down even further, it's a medical product that isn't a drug or a biologic, and that's essentially it. And as you can see, that's an extremely broad definition. Everything from tongue depressors to thermometers, the whole way to robotic surgery devices and advanced AI algorithms and machine learning tools fall within this bucket. And so it stands to reason that these products should not be regulated in the same fashion, and they aren't under the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. It's tiered by 3 classes of products, 1, 2, and 3, and products are placed into these particular classes based on the level of regulatory control that's necessary to reasonably assure the safety and effectiveness of the product. And so if you find yourself being a regulated product, most companies hope that they can fall within the class 1 bucket because very little is actually required, at least in the pre-market context. You have to follow what are known as general controls, which are regulatory controls that are applicable to every type of medical device. And it's like things like good manufacturing practices, making sure you have protocols in place to handle adverse event reports and things like that. Moving up the list, class 2 is the intermediate devices where FDA has made a determination that general controls in and of themselves are not enough to assure that level of safety and effectiveness. And these are actually really sort of specialized. Special controls can be anything. FDA usually works with industry and then convenes panels to come up with individually tailored controls for a particular product type. The third class is class 3. I haven't seen a lot of digital-based products wind up in this class so far. It's usually, these are like invasive devices, implantables, artificial hearts, things of that nature that fall within class 3. And depending on what class you're in will directly impact the marketing pathway for your product. Class 1 products, like I said, have a low level of regulatory control, and so FDA doesn't expect you to come in with a marketing submission to prove the safety and effectiveness of that product. You can just go directly to market as long as you're following the general controls. As you move up, the marketing pathways get more stringent. They're more costly user fees to FDA. They require more data to be submitted. And I don't want to go through all of them because I think that's going to get a little bit too much in the weeds, but what we've seen generally with digital-based products is that many are winding up in this de novo pathway, which is a class 2, potentially class 1 pathway for products that don't have a predicate already on the market. Typically, when you're getting on the market with FDA, you're comparing your product to another product that's already out there. But with a lot of this new digital technology, there's nothing that FDA has to compare it to. And so it's sort of a mini full application that requires data that will be the first to move on the market. This is just sort of a summary of what we discussed, and I don't have to walk through it again. So getting into digital health, what does this mean? What does this backdrop mean for algorithms, for digital-based products? Well, what FDA started to see in the very early 2010s is that a lot of companies were coming in that were software-based that hadn't dealt with the agency before. And they were trying to fit the review of those products into the traditional medical device paradigm that I've just described, but it didn't seem to be a good fit. And that makes sense for a host of reasons. Namely, the first one is that the medical device amendments were enacted in 1976. And while I would argue that they were pretty forward-looking in the way that they handle regulation, there's this idea that technology can leapfrog and build off itself. The fact of the matter is the drafters at the time just couldn't have had the foresight to anticipate this digital software-based medical health economy that's sort of emerging right now. And so what you have is a process that was built and designed around hardware-based medical products, which simply aren't developed, designed, and implemented the way that software-based products are. The controls that are in place are for traditional manufacturing, products that roll down assembly lines that are put together with physical parts. And if you know about software development, it's more a living product. Information is constantly coming into the developers. They're reviewing that, they're patching, they're adding features, and doing all these different things to hopefully make the product better. But under FDA regulation right now, every time something like that happens, you would have to come back into FDA and get a new approval for the product. And digital health developers were uncomfortable with that. They thought that would slow innovation for the amount of time it would take FDA to review all these individual products. They would have wanted to do 3 or 4 other updates. To FDA's credit, the agency did realize this starting in the early 2010s when I was there. And so what they did was start to identify sort of the low-risk, low-hanging fruit. There were all these health phone apps that were coming out at the time, and FDA really took a hard look and said, do we need to be reviewing all of these? Are these products posing risks to patients? And they found that they weren't. And so they started to issue what are called enforcement discretion guidances in the early 2010s, which basically say, you might be a medical device, you might meet that 201H definition, but because of the low risk profile of the product, we're simply not interested in regulating you as a company. People were, generally pretty comfortable with the content of those, but we were dealing with a brand new industry of tech developers as opposed to people that had interacted with the agency for a number of years. And if you ever look at these guidance documents, directly on the front, there's a big, bold boilerplate that says, this is not law. This is not binding on you, this is not binding on us as the government, and you generally get the impression that FDA could pull the rug out from under you whenever they want to. That's really not the case. They're kind of mini rulemakings, and FDA issues a ton of these things. And so if they started to behave in a way where they were pulling these guidances or changing their opinions, every other day, and the agency would lose a lot of credibility. But nevertheless, if you're a young software company and you're trying to get funding, and you show up and the regulatory assessment is always a part of that, and the only thing that you have is one document that says, this doesn't really mean anything, it's kind of the general musings of the agency at the time, that could be problematic. And so what happened is, and this is what happens with a bunch of other industries, is they went to Congress and to their credit got the 21st Century Cures Act software provisions enacted at the end of 2016. And what those provisions did, essentially, was just take what FDA had already put into their enforcement discretion guidance documents and codified them, put them into legislation. And so what you have now is, instead of enforcement discretion for these very low-hanging fruit, low-risk type products, they were just removed from the definition of medical device. So that's all well and good, and people like that, but there's still a lot of products that are left under FDA's regulatory purview, and the agency's been grappling with how to handle that. And so they issued a Digital Health Innovation Action Plan at the end of 2017, and there are certain steps that they've been taking. They've been issuing new guidance documents. They've been trying to hire new personnel that are experienced in this area. And most significantly, they've been working on what is called the Software Precertification Pilot Program. I would say that this program is probably the most talked about. It had the most enthusiasm, but also the most controversy. And they've been working on it. I think at this point, I'm getting about out of time, but I would just say, if you're considering the Software Precertification Pilot Program, understand that it's not a completed program yet. FDA is still working on it, and we're not exactly sure how it's going to pan out in the long run. This is sort of a visualization of the chart, and the only point I would make about this is the marketing pathway statutory provisions have not changed. So it's not like FDA is lowering the burden through the Software Precertification Pilot Program. It's just pushing around burden to different parts of it. So it might have provide a lower barrier to entry for software-based products, but at the same time, it allows FDA greater access to your day-to-day operations and requires other reporting that otherwise wouldn't be required through a traditional pathway. Finally, just a few words of wisdom as I wrap up, and that's, if you are starting to develop these technologies, incorporate things, have a plan ready. I mentioned it at the beginning, don't be caught unaware. Don't have the first time you're thinking about FDA regulation be when the agency shows up and is demanding answers. to that end, I would recommend, reading the 21st Century Cures Act software provisions, FDA's guidance on the subject, and just understanding generally what the lay of the land is for this area of regulation. And then one thing that I've seen a lot, and I would caution not to overly rely on, is that folks tend to think because we're a group of physicians that FDA is not going to regulate us. And that's true to some extent. FDA doesn't regulate the practice of medicine, but if you have a group of physicians that is generally acting like traditional medical device manufacturers, FDA is not going to allow you to hang under that umbrella and get out from FDA regulation. So with that, happy to take any questions.
We're supposed to be a panel, so we'll just be a standing panel and get our steps. Hi, do we have questions for Alexis or Ian? Yes.
Hi, my name is Victoria Moy with Innovatio Health Design. We're developing a predictive analytics software, I guess you'd call it, and I've been advised that we may not fall under the purview of FDA. However, that as we do our development work, that we should prepare all our documentation as if the FDA will come looking for us. Is that good advice? Is it too much work to do? We're a startup. What do you advise?
I would say you don't have to prepare as if you are regulated, but you do have to diligence whether you might be, with some degree of certainty, right? And this happens all the time, and it really requires road mapping what exactly you're trying to do with your software, with your analytics. I would think about what your 3 to 5 year plan is, what features you want to add, what you want the analytics to actually show, how you'll label them, how you're going to market them to to patients, to healthcare companies, and then do a review based on the 21st Century Cures Act and FDA's software provisions. There's also ways to contact FDA too to ask them specific questions about, hey, we're planning on doing something like this or this. What do you think? Is this going to fall within regulation? It's called a 513G request, so not to get too in the weeds, but yeah, where you can get some answers from FDA about that. So I would say you don't have to prepare sort of an entire submission ready to go if you don't know you're going to be in that regulated box, but just to do the work up front to figure out whether you might be.
We have clients that will at least go through, not for the FDA, but for Medicaid, to prepare when you're selling into a Medicaid market with a health plan, to at least have the documents ready to go, because the sooner you can get that into filing, the sooner you're going to get approval. And we see a lot of flat-footed vendors that come in expecting the MCO or the managed care plan to be able to submit all the paperwork. And in fact, they both are looking at each other and doing this. So that's one piece of advice. Another question.
Yeah, Alexis, so on the international front, a number of years ago, the radiology companies and Nighthawks, et cetera, they sent people to Australia, great life there. They seem to have no problem taking care of American hospital patients, et cetera, from international. And yet on the more general telehealth front these days, it seems to be a no-no. Did something change? Are radiologists able to do this differently, or wondered what your thoughts, how they were able to get away with it for so long, and if they still can, why?
Well, I know that we did a lot of work back in the day, it seems like now, to actually deal with the licensure issues in particular. But Medicare actually, this is sort of perhaps a little known fact, Medicare actually doesn't define, telehealth doesn't include radiology from a Medicare perspective, right? Because it doesn't necessitate a provider-patient communication. You're just looking at a scan, right? So on that front, at least, it was viewed a little differently, although they still, the being on U.S. soil piece still applied. And that's when the concept of overreads, we sort of got a little crafty with how you could do that. But yeah, hopefully that answers your question. The licensure piece, though, to my knowledge, I've never been aware of anybody not really sort of following the lines there. I think there were some countries, though, that didn't necessarily have a lot of clarity. But now in the Middle East, et cetera, there's very detailed guidance, in particular with teleradiology. So it is sort of still leading the edge in the telemedicine ex-US policy, if that helps. Yeah.
Question down here.
So, no fair.
Yeah, my
Another
question
question.
is regarding second opinion with the US physician, the specialist with other countries. What we have noticed is due to significant difference in the currency, let's see in Asia, they want a second opinion from a pulmonologist or cardiologist sitting in US. The maximum they can charge, like I will give an example of Pakistan, like 5,000 rupees. That's almost $30 hair. Do you think, this is scalable, or we can have adoption of this? Like the highest they can charge is 5,000, but it's just a $30 hair. So how you will get the pulmonologists and cardiologists involved just for $30? So how we can scale this down the road?
I probably need a business person more than me, but here's my 2 cents on it. Right now, what I'm seeing with the second opinion programs has primarily been a move towards high net worth individuals outside the U.S. Who are willing to pay. I mean, these are folks who will, take a whole wing of the Cleveland Clinic, right, with their whole family if they have an issue. And so they would obviously love to have, a second opinion or somebody else coming to them virtually, and they'll pay premium dollars for that. Most of the commercial programs that we're observing are really meant for high net worth individuals, and so, a little bit with programs internationally that are covered by insurers or self-insured employers as well. But yeah, I agree. It's not really scalable for the masses.
Yeah, like a question about the FDA. They released a new draft version about clinical support like a week ago. As you know, right now for machine learning, they do not allow updated algorithm, even though it is better. It could be better. So what are your insights, and when do you think change is going to happen?
They released a paper on it a while ago, and it wasn't even a guidance document. It was a discussion paper on how to handle machine learning algorithms. And so there's a whole process out there that they're contemplating, and I think they fully appreciate and understand the fact that AI is the future, and if they're going to exclude that from these clinical decision support, software exemptions, or make it very difficult for evolving AI to work through the regulatory process, that they're going to have a problem on their hands. And so, what they're envisioning is, through the course of an application for AI, to also require a test plan to be submitted. So you would have to submit a protocol that explains, how you're going to quarantine off, the machine learning aspect of the program, to see how it runs, to see how it tests. And this would all be done internally at the company. That wouldn't require submission to the FDA. But once it gets through that process, and if they've approved the process, then you would be allowed to incorporate sort of the next steps of the machine learning process. It wouldn't be real time, right? That you can't just let the machine run wild. FDA is just not going to allow that. But they will potentially allow for internal testing through small periods, and then sort of iterative upgrades, I would say.